Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? What looks like a perfect family photo can hide years of quiet cuts. Yesterday, they posted their annual holiday picture without me again, and this time I did not even get an invite. I cannot tell you how many times I stared at that picture, reading the comments from neighbors and cousins about how perfect our family looks, while my own name was nowhere in sight, my existence cropped out like I was a mistake they were fixing with a filter. And before you ask, no, I did not decline, I did not skip, I was never even told when the gathering would happen. I learned about it the way strangers do, scrolling, watching, being told in coded words that the family is whole, but I am not a part of it. It would be easier to laugh this off if it were just one year or one misunderstanding, but this pattern has been going on for as long as I can remember. Each December bringing another round of explanations that sound different on the surface, but always mean the same thing. I do not belong in the middle of their carefully staged image. There was the year when my sister Brooke said the outfits needed to match a neutral palette, and I showed up in something I had bought just for the occasion, only to be told that maybe I should sit this one out so the theme stayed consistent. There was the year when I actually stood there in the lineup, smiling like an idiot, and then weeks later I saw the posted version with me cropped off the side. No one mentioned it, no one apologized, and when I asked about it they said, "Oh, the framing just worked better that way." That is the kind of casual cruelty that never makes the caption. And here is the part that burns the most. While they were cutting me out of their frame, they never hesitated to step right into mine when it was convenient. Brooke and her husband Evan asked me for help with their down payment years ago, and because I was the younger sister desperate for approval, I wired the money without a second thought. When my parents wanted to show off how proud they were of me starting my company, they slapped my startup's logo onto their business newsletter without asking, and they mailed it around town like it was theirs to use. At the time I told myself it was love, it was family, it was harmless. But the second I pushed back, the second I asked to be treated like more than a prop, suddenly I was too sensitive and always overreacting. So when I saw that glossy new picture yesterday, with Brooke front and center and my parents holding Ruth's hands and Evan standing tall like he owned the family name, I felt something inside me snap. Not with rage, but with this icy clarity. I realized that I have been subsidizing their perfect photo while being erased from it. My money made their lives easier. My silence made their image cleaner, and my absence kept the peace. And I decided that this time I would not play the same role again. I called my friend Maya, who has been telling me for years to stop being the family's quiet bank account, and I told her it was time to start drawing lines that actually cost them something. Together we drafted two simple, polite documents. The first was a repayment plan addressed to Brooke and Evan, outlining the loan I gave them, with exact figures and a schedule that does not bend. No drama, just math. The second was a short legal note regarding the misuse of my company's logo on those old newsletters, instructing them to remove all archived versions and issue a correction. Nothing flashy, nothing cruel, just paperwork that makes it impossible for them to pretend my role was optional. The reaction was immediate. Brooke texted in her usual sugar-coated panic, acting like I had ruined her weekend plans, asking if we could talk about this over brunch, as if brunch could rewrite a contract. My mom called me not even an hour later with that calm, careful tone she uses when she is about to guilt me into silence. She said, "Ava, please do not do anything to upset your grandmother." Which, if you read between the lines, meant that the family already sensed I had something bigger in mind, something that might leave a mark they could not crop out. And maybe she is right. Maybe I do. Because here is the truth. I am done being the quiet shadow in their picture. I am done watching them cash in on my success while painting me out of the memory. I have resources now, I have a voice, and if they want to pretend I am not part of the family, then I will make sure the world sees me standing right in front of them, whether they like it or not. Can you guess what I am planning next? I woke up this morning to the kind of tight little hurricane that only family can spin up without breaking a sweat, because while I was making coffee and trying to pretend I did not care, my phone lit up with screenshots from a cousin who still likes me enough to send receipts, and there it was, Brooke in the relatives group chat explaining in her smooth, reasonable voice that I am impossible to schedule, that I am always booked. that I prefer my work people to family, and that they had tried their best, but I simply could not make time, and it is crazy how a sentence can be built out of soft words and still bruise like a punch, because the truth is I was not asked, I was not told, I was not considered. And yet the story being told about me was that I am the unreliable one who chooses boardrooms over birthdays. I stared at those messages long enough to feel the old reflex heat up in my chest, that urge to fire back a point-by-point correction with dates and times, and the way last year I was told to swing by after pictures, as if I should be grateful for the leftovers. And the year before that when they sent me a group text to a number they knew I had changed, and the time before that when Brooke asked me to bring neutral tones, and then announced she was going for a candid vibe right as I arrived, so that the only candid thing was my face falling off the edge of the frame, and I almost typed out the whole miserable timeline, but then I stopped, because I finally understood that the story does not change when I explain it to people who profit from the confusion. It changes when I stop supplying the image they need from me, which is the apologetic little sister who smooths everything over and pays for the cake. So instead of defending myself in a chat designed to make me beg for space, I changed the environment in a way they would feel, and I did it without shouting or begging or even stepping into the room. Because I opened my calendar and moved a booking I had been holding to a date that mattered to them more than it would ever matter to me. And I hired the photographer they have used every holiday for years for a corporate shoot with my team on the very morning they love to schedule their pictures. And when the confirmation came through with the studio address and the time block that covered their sweet spot, I felt a clean, steady calm I have never felt with them, the kind that shows up when a boundary turns from theory into logistics. Because now they would have to choose between a second-choice photographer or a different idea of perfect, and either way they would know that I do not exist to make their plans smooth while they erase me from the results. Maya laughed when I told her, not a mean laugh, but the sharp little laugh of someone who has been waiting for me to stop trying to trade respect for patience, and she said, "Keep the caption for your corporate post focused on your team. Make it about the work and the people who show up for you, and let the attention follow the energy instead of the bloodline." And I did exactly that, because we shot the photos in the morning, and I posted a short, warm note about a milestone we had hit and the faces that built it, and I tagged the photographer and my company and no one else, and the comments rolled in from clients and friends and a few reporters who had been circling a story, and it felt like air after being underwater. Since for once I was in the frame by design and not by pleading. By noon my mother called with that voice that makes me feel 14 years old and guilty for existing, and she told me that people were asking questions and that Brooke was upset and that it would be kinder if I just let the family have their day without complications. Because apparently moving a calendar block for a professional shoot is a complication, while cutting your daughter from a picture is a tradition, and I told her clearly and gently that I am not disrupting anything, I am just not donating my spine to hold up an image that does not include me, and she sighed the way she does when she wants me to climb down, and then she said that grandma is sensitive to public conflict and could I please keep things off social media, and I said I heard her. And that I would never use grandma as a prop, and that is when it hit me all over again that this family loves to tell me I am the one who makes things public when the only public thing I have ever done is breathe while successful. Around 3, Evan texted, pretending to be light and helpful while weaving in his usual little hooks, and he wrote that since I am doing so well and obviously understand branding, could I help sponsor the rescheduled photo at the new venue they found after losing their favorite photographer, and that it would mean so much to Grandma if I could cover the rental and maybe a small catered spread because the holidays have been expensive this year. And while we are at it, could I secure a rush turnaround on retouching so they can post before the weekend rush? And he dropped a line that told me exactly how they see me, because he wrote, "You always save the day." And I sat there with my phone in my hand and thought about how many times I have saved a day that I was not invited to join, and how often I have paid for the table where I was asked to stand, and I felt the quiet answer rise up and settle in my throat. I typed a single word, a word that lets him know I read every line and filed it away and will respond on my terms, not on his clock, and I pressed send, and when the 3 little dots stopped blinking without another message coming in, I knew he understood that something fundamental had shifted, and if you are wondering what that word was, it was this. Noted. By the time the weekend arrived, I had already decided that silence was no longer going to be my only response, because as much as I had spent years brushing off the casual digs, the exclusion, and the erasure that came every holiday, I finally understood that every "just let it go" and every "don't make this bigger than it is" had only trained them to believe I would always absorb the hit without leaving a mark, and I realized that if I wanted to change the rhythm, I needed to create a trail they could not rewrite or talk their way around. So when Maya showed up at my apartment with a folder in her hands, I sat down at my kitchen table knowing this was not about feelings or venting anymore. This was about drawing the kind of line that exists in black and white and does not fade under the pressure of group denial. Inside that folder was the old family business newsletter from years ago, the one I had almost forgotten, where my company's logo had been plastered across the back page as if we had officially endorsed their seasonal campaign. At the time I had brushed it off, even smiled when my dad said, "We're just proud of you." But now, staring at the printed copy, I saw it for what it really was: free leverage for them. An easy way to benefit from my work while still pretending in every social circle that I was the outsider who cared more about strangers than about family. Maya pointed out that even though the mailer was years old, the archived digital copy was still live on their business site, meaning the claim technically still existed in the public space, and that gave me standing to demand its removal. She said, very calmly, that I didn't even need to push hard, just a clean letter reminding them that it misrepresented my business and that failure to correct it could expose them to liability. It wasn't about dragging them into a lawsuit, it was about making them understand that my name and my work are not props they can use when it suits them and erase when it doesn't. At the same time, I had been quietly researching Billboard leases, and I learned that while most people think of them as locked down for months, plenty of vendors sell short-term placements to fill gaps, sometimes as little as 2 weeks. And the costs are not out of reach for someone who has spent years funding other people's parties and trips. When I found one facing the very street my grandmother's house sits on, it felt almost too clean to be real. The vendor told me they could prep the space within 10 days if I submitted the design quickly. That was when I realized the legal step and the visual step were part of the same play, the paper trail to remove what they had stolen, and the billboard to display what they could never steal again. Still, I had to confront myself in that moment, because part of me worried that maybe I was being petty, that maybe I was about to hurt the one person I did not want to wound, my grandmother Ruth, who has always been kind, but also quiet in the face of Brooke's dominance. I sat there with the mock-up on my laptop screen, the clean white text against a dark background reading only Forbes 30 under 30 says hi, and I asked myself if this was cruelty or clarity. The answer that came back was blunt. Cruelty would be naming names, dragging private fights into public spectacle, or airing every debt and betrayal. Clarity was a single sentence that said, "I exist, and you cannot crop me out." So I finalized the design, filed the lease under a holding company I named after my grandmother's maiden name, because if I was going to spend money to make a point, I wanted at least a sliver of it to honor the woman who unknowingly kept me tethered to this mess and wired the deposit. It was both terrifying and liberating, because now it wasn't just talk, it was a clock ticking toward a moment I could not take back. Meanwhile, Maya helped me draft a short formal letter to the family business, demanding the removal of my logo and a correction statement noting that no such endorsement ever existed. We didn't frame it with fire, just fact. And within 48 hours, without a phone call or a text, they quietly pulled down the archive and replaced it with a new PDF. They didn't say a word to me, which told me more than an argument ever could, because silence from them has always meant acknowledgement they don't want to give voice to. That correction was my proof. When the threat of exposure appears, they move. That weekend, I didn't go anywhere near the family chat, didn't answer Brooke's sugar-dip texts, didn't respond to Evan's half-serious, "You wouldn't really do something dramatic, right?" message. Instead, I waited for the official permit approval from the Billboard company, and when it hit my inbox late on Sunday night, stamped and final, I opened a bottle of wine by myself, sat back on the couch, and whispered, "We are really doing this." Because for the first time in years, I wasn't the girl waiting to be asked to stand in a frame someone else designed. I was the woman designing my own frame, one they couldn't crop, one they couldn't deny, one they couldn't rewrite, and if they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then fine. I would make sure that every car driving past Grandma's street saw exactly what they refused to. And if you think they are going to take this lying down, you are very wrong. The quiet before the storm is already humming, and when it breaks, I will be ready. The morning the billboard went up, I woke earlier than usual, not because of excitement exactly, but because there was this restless hum in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something irreversible is about to happen, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, telling myself over and over that this was not a tantrum. It was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was a line in the sand after decades of being asked to step quietly aside, and now the image they loved so much, the perfect family portrait that had always erased me, was about to have competition that they could not delete, crop, or caption into something else. By the time I drove over to the corner where the vendor had told me the installation crew would be working, I had already rehearsed in my head what it would feel like to see my own name, my own success, looming over the same street where my grandmother watered her front garden, greeted her neighbors, and told anyone who would listen how proud she was of her family. Except, of course, she never dared say the same thing about me out loud, not in the same way, not where Brooke could hear. When the canvas unfurled and those plain words came into view, black and white, nothing fancy, nothing aggressive, just a sentence that carried more weight than 1,000 explanations, I felt this strange mixture of pride and grief. Because on one hand it was the cleanest way I could say, "You cannot erase me anymore," and on the other hand it was undeniable proof that I had been erased so many times that I had to resort to a billboard to make the truth undeniable. The workers barely glanced at me. They just did their job and drove away, leaving me standing there across the street with my arms crossed, watching cars slow down as drivers lean their heads to read, and in that moment I knew that every relative, every neighbor, every childhood friend who drove by would have to register the fact that the daughter, the sister, the cousin who supposedly never showed up was right there in 30-foot letters reminding them all that erasure has a price. I didn't post a selfie, I didn't make an announcement, I didn't even tell my closest coworkers. Instead, I scheduled a small geofenced ad campaign that only triggered for people within a mile of my grandmother's house. A short video clip of my team celebrating a milestone at the office with the caption, "Building what we were told we didn't deserve," because I wanted the contrast to be sharp but not vulgar, undeniable but not sloppy. And sure enough, by noon the family group chat, the one I was no longer in but still received screenshots from, went from dead silence to explosion mode. Brooke was furious, writing long rants about how I had humiliated them, how I had embarrassed Grandma, how I had crossed a line by dragging my career into private family matters. My mother chimed in with her usual script, saying I should take the billboard down before anyone important saw it, and my father, never one to waste words, forwarded me a single paragraph about humility that sounded suspiciously like it had been copied from a church newsletter. But then, right in the middle of all that noise, my phone rang, and it was Grandma. I braced myself for tears, for guilt, for that tired line about how family is all we have, but instead her voice was quiet, steady, almost sad, and she simply asked, "Can you stop by for tea?" No lecture, no accusations, just a request, and that was enough to make me drive straight there without thinking twice. When I walked into her kitchen, she didn't point at the window where the billboard was visible. She didn't mention Brooke. She didn't even bring up the picture. Instead, she sat me down and said that she had kept every article ever written about me, printed and clipped, tucked into a shoebox in her bedroom because she didn't know how to use the internet well enough to save them digitally, and she said, "I didn't post them because I didn't want to make trouble, but I always knew." For a moment I thought I might cry, because that was the closest thing to validation I had ever gotten from her, and it was locked away in a box no one else had ever seen. I told her then, as calmly as I could, that I wasn't doing any of this to punish her, that the billboard wasn't about making her uncomfortable, that it was about finally speaking in the only language Brooke and my parents seemed to respect, public image. I told her I was finished begging for scraps of acknowledgement, finished paying for tables I wasn't invited to sit at, and that I was done pretending peace meant anything if it required my silence. She nodded, slowly, and she didn't argue. She just reached for my hand and said, "I always wanted you to be strong enough to stop waiting for them." When I left her house that afternoon, there was Brooke standing outside on the sidewalk, her face tight, her jaw set, and in her hands was a printed cease and desist letter she had clearly pulled from some template online, claiming that my billboard was causing her emotional distress and threatening to take me to court if I didn't remove it immediately. I looked at her, at the paper she was holding like it was a weapon, and for the first time in years I didn't feel small. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't even feel angry. I just smiled, not sarcastic, not cruel, just a smile that said I had already thought 3 steps ahead, and I told her one sentence before walking to my car. "See you tomorrow." Because the truth was she didn't understand yet that the billboard wasn't the end of the plan. It was only the middle. And the part that was coming next would make her little cease and desist look like a joke. By the time dawn edged into the kind of muted morning that makes everything feel suspended between what was and what will be, I had already decided that the last move would not be a louder version of the billboard or a longer list of receipts, but something cleaner and heavier. Something that would plant a stake in the ground with my grandmother's name and make it impossible for anyone to pretend later that they did not know where the line was, so I called the community foundation that had helped a friend set up a donor program, and I told them I wanted to fund an annual scholarship in my grandmother's maiden name for students who have been pushed to the edges of rooms and rosters and group photos. Kids who are told politely that they are difficult to schedule or hard to fit or maybe too much to include, and I said the application would have one question only, written in plain language, asking them to describe a time they were erased and what they built anyway. Because I wanted the entire exercise to be a mirror held up to the game that has been played on me for years without flinching. When the paperwork cleared and the seed money left my account, it felt nothing like the old transfers I used to make to cover someone else's crisis or optics, since those payments vanished into silence, while this one generated a page, a definition, a form, and a promise, and in that moment I understood that the difference between revenge that rots and revenge that sets you free is whether it dies with the clap back or outlives the argument by doing something measured and undeniable. So I wrote the announcement in straightforward words that any neighbor could read without squinting. I attached one photograph only, my grandmother's high school portrait that she keeps taped inside a kitchen cabinet door. And I scheduled it to publish the same morning the family planned their red-hot holiday picture, because timing matters when people respect optics more than truth. My parents texted first, not to congratulate or ask questions, but to summon, which is how they speak when they want to skip the part where they acknowledge harm and rush to the part where I calm everyone down. And they wrote that Grandma was worried and could I please come by before things got more public, so I went. Not as the child who used to accept whatever was offered, but as the adult who had already decided how this would end. And I sat at the table while they rehearsed the lines about keeping private matters private, about humility, about family unity, and I listened until they were finished, and then I laid it out clearly, that I am not negotiating my existence, that peace which depends on me disappearing is not peace, that I am not removing anything or apologizing for a sentence that says nothing except that I exist, and that some people with my last name would prefer I did not. And when my father finally said the words that had always been underneath, that Brooke feels calmer when the attention is not split, and that the holidays are simpler when I keep a low profile, I felt the last thread snap in my chest, not with rage, but with relief, because finally the truth had come out in daylight where it could not be edited later. Then came the part one had promised myself I would do if I ever got the chance, which was to make a picture that did not need their permission and did not require their alignment, so I stepped outside with my grandmother, who had asked in a voice that was soft but steady if we could take a photo together for her own wall before the world rushed in, and I had a photographer waiting at the curb with a simple setup. And we stood at the edge of her yard with the billboard visible down the block, not posing like a campaign, but standing like two people who were done pretending they did not know each other's worth, and the shutter clicked, and Grandma laughed this small surprised laugh, like the sound a locked box makes when it finally opens, and she squeezed my fingers and said, "That one is mine," which hit me harder than any apology from anyone else could. I posted that single image on the scholarship page and made it the header. No hashtags, no performance, just a caption stating that a legacy is built by who you stand beside when it costs something, and then, because I never intended to build a monument to a moment of anger, I called the vendor and scheduled the billboard to come down the following week, not because I was backing off or because anyone had won me over, but because the point had been made and the message had been delivered, and the longer victory was now living in a fund with my grandmother's name on it and in a photograph they could never crop without revealing exactly what they were doing. Brooke tried one last pass, a legal-sounding email full of phrases she had clearly pasted from a search bar mixed with a plea about how I was damaging the family brand. And I wrote back a brief note stating that any claim would be frivolous and that all further communication should go through counsel. And then I did something she did not expect, which was to invite her, in one sentence and without sugar, to contribute to the scholarship if she actually cared about the kind of kids she pretended to champion in her holiday captions, and I think she understood then that the game had flipped, because all I got in return was silence that carried the scent of recognition. Later that evening, a group text pinged with an invitation to a May-up dinner, a chance to reset, a promise that this time it would just be immediate family and we could talk things through calmly. And I stood there with my phone in my hand and I let the vibration fade while I looked at the scholarship site on my laptop and at the photo of my grandmother and me holding our ground under a sky that did not care about anyone's feelings. And I realized that whether I went or not would not change the frame I had already built, because for the first time in years I was no longer waiting outside a room hoping to be called in. I was in my own room with the door open to anyone willing to respect the person standing in it. So I put the phone down without replying. I poured tea into the cup my grandmother keeps for me, and I said out loud, not to the room but to myself, that I finally know my worth, and if you are wondering how the story ends, it ends like this. The billboard will come down in a few days because it did its job. The scholarship will open in the spring. My grandmother will have a framed photo that no one can crop without looking cruel, and my family can either step into a picture where I am centered in my own life or keep posing in a frame that tells on them, and either way I won.